January 11, 1944. Over Nazi Germany, more than 30 Luftwaffe fighters line up for a textbook slaughter of American B-17s. Between them stands one P-51 Mustang. Its pilot isn't chasing kills. He's doing math at 25,000 feet, using position timing and nerve to break an entire air war doctrine alone. Before James Howard ever touched the controls of a fighter aircraft, he learned a harder lesson on the ground, far from runways, radars, or war. He was born in 1913 in Guangzhou, a place where problems didn't come with manuals, spare parts, or second chances. Howard grew up in a missionary family, working in harsh, resource-starved conditions. His parents treated illness and injury with limited tools, improvised solutions, and zero margin for error. If something broke, there was no replacement. If a decision was wrong, the consequences were immediate. Survival depended on preparation, discipline, and cold logic, not emotion. This environment shaped Howard long before the military did. While others learned heroics from adventure stories, he learned systems thinking. Every action had to account for what came next. Every choice had to conserve resources. You didn't rush. You didn't gamble. You solved problems. That mindset became instinct. Howard learned to observe before acting, to calculate before committing, and to accept that perfection was impossible, but efficiency was not. In Guangzhou, he absorbed a truth that would later define his combat style. When resources are limited, thinking becomes the most powerful weapon you have. Years later, at 25,000 feet over Europe, with fuel draining and enemies closing in, this wasn't philosophy. It was muscle memory. And the sky would soon become his problem set. The aircraft that would later dominate the skies didn't begin as a legend. It began as a gamble. In 1940, with Britain desperate for fighters, Royal Air Force turned to an American company few considered revolutionary. What followed was the NA-73XD, designed, engineered, and flown in just 102 days, a pace so aggressive it raised eyebrows across the aviation world. On paper, the aircraft that would become the P-51 Mustang looked promising: clean aerodynamics, laminar flow wings, exceptional range. But in combat theory, met altitude and failed. Early Mustangs were powered by the Allison 1710 engine. Below 15,000 feet, it performed well. Above that, power collapsed. In the thin air where real air wars were decided, the Mustang gasped. German fighters ruled the high ground. Bomber formations needed protection where the Mustangs simply couldn't fight. Pilots were unimpressed. Commanders were skeptical. Critics dismissed it as a reconnaissance aircraft, fast, elegant, and tactically irrelevant. In a war obsessed with dogfights and kill counts, the Mustang looked like a machine without a purpose. But buried inside its design was something few noticed: efficiency. The Mustang wasn't built to win fights, it was built to end them. It had the bones of a long-range predator waiting for the right mind and the right engine to unlock what it was truly meant to do. In a world that celebrated swagger and instinct, James Howard was an anomaly. He didn't fit the image of the wartime fighter pilot: the cigarette, the grin, the hunger for dogfights. Howard was quiet, analytical, the kind of man who stayed behind after briefings, rereading mission reports while others chased adrenaline. To his squadron mates, he didn't hunt in the air. He calculated. Howard treated combat like a live equation. Altitude, energy, airspeed angles, every variable mattered, and every decision had a cost. While many pilots relied on reflex and bravado, Howard relied on preparation. He studied enemy patterns. He memorized aircraft performance charts. He asked, not how do I win this fight, but how do I avoid needing one at all? Pilots later said flying with Howard felt different. There was no wasted motion, no dramatic maneuvering. His Mustang moved with purpose, always positioned where it needed to be next, not where the fight was happening now. One teammate famously described it as watching someone solve a math problem in real time at 400 miles an hour. This mindset made him an outsider, but it also made him dangerous in a way few recognized. Howard wasn't chasing kills or glory. He was obsessed with outcomes, mission success, survival, control. And when the war demanded something more than courage, when it demanded clarity under impossible pressure, this quiet thinker would prove that in the air brains could be deadlier than bullets. Before Europe hardened him, the East tested him. In the skies over Burma and China, Howard flew with the American Volunteer Group, better known as the Flying Tigers. This wasn't a clean, rule-bound air war. It was brutal, asymmetric, and unforgiving. Fuel was scarce. Aircraft were worn. Backup plans didn't exist. The enemy was the Japanese Army Air Force, fast, aggressive, and deadly at low to medium altitude. Outnumbered and often outgunned, survival depended on discipline, not heroics. And above all, on doctrine. That doctrine came from one man, Claire Chennault. Chennault rejected the romanticism of dogfighting. He taught geometry, energy management, and exploitation of aircraft strengths. Dive hard, hit once, disengage, never fight fair. Altitude was life. Speed was armor. Turning contests were suicide. Howard absorbed it all. Here he learned to weaponize patience, to let the enemy commit first, to use vertical space like a lever, converting altitude into violence and escape at will. He learned that a fighter didn't need to dominate the sky, it needed to control the terms of engagement. Most importantly, Howard learned something that would later define his legacy. Air combat isn't about destruction. It's about denial, denying the enemy clean attacks, clean shots, clean decisions. In the chaos of the Asian theater, Howard wasn't becoming an ace. He was becoming something rarer, a tactician forged in scarcity where every move had to matter and every mistake could not be undone. The Mustang didn't change overnight. It was unlocked. The breakthrough came when engineers married the airframe's elegant aerodynamics to the Rolls-Royce Merlin, an engine built not just for speed, but for altitude. With its two-stage, two-speed supercharger, the Merlin breathed where others suffocated. Above 25,000 feet, everything changed. The P-51 Mustang was suddenly operating in the same thin air as German interceptors and outperforming them. It could climb with the Bf-109, outrun the FW-190, escort bombers deep into enemy territory, and still have fuel to fight on the way home. This wasn't an upgrade, it was a system completed. For Howard, the Merlin didn't just add horsepower, it added predictability. Throttle response became linear, energy retention became reliable, high-altitude performance became a constant instead of a variable. The Mustang was no longer a compromise aircraft. It was a precision instrument. Where other fighters forced pilots to react, the Merlin-powered Mustang allowed anticipation. It turned altitude into options, speed into leverage, range into control. For a pilot who thought in terms of geometry and outcomes, this machine wasn't just fast, it was logical. At 28,000 feet, with the Merlin humming steadily, Howard finally had what he'd been waiting for: an aircraft that could keep up with his calculations. The war in the air was about to change, not because of courage, but because technology and thinking had finally met at the same altitude. By late 1943, the U.S. daylight bombing campaign was bleeding. The doctrine was clear, confident, and catastrophically wrong. The 8th Air Force believed that tight formations of B-17 Flying Fortress could defend themselves. Interlocking machine guns, mutual protection, no long-range escort required. Reality disagreed. Deep over Germany, bomber losses surged past 20% on some missions. Crews were cut down by disciplined, coordinated attacks from the Luftwaffe. Head-on passes shattered formations. Rear assaults tore through stragglers. What planners called acceptable losses became unsustainable carnage. The idea of the self-defending bomber was exposed for what it was: a theory built in classrooms, not in combat. Without fighter escort at altitude, and range bomber streams became predictable corridors of destruction. Crews knew it. Pilots felt it. Every mission felt less like strategy and more like roulette. Inside briefing rooms, confidence quietly eroded. If bombers couldn't survive alone and fighters couldn't reach them, then the entire daylight bombing strategy was at risk of collapse. This wasn't just a tactical problem, it was a doctrinal crisis. And somewhere above that chaos, in a cockpit designed for endurance and altitude, James Howard was watching it all unfold, understanding that the solution wouldn't come from more guns, more bravado, or more formations. It would come from presence, from putting a fighter where doctrine said it didn't belong and daring the enemy to make the next move. To the bomber crews, it felt unstoppable. Out of the sun and clouds came the fighters of the Luftwaffe, charging straight at the noses of American B-17s. No weaving, no hesitation. Just a violent closing speed collision course where both sides tore open fire at nearly 600 miles per hour. It was called the head-on attack, and it was devastating. From the German perspective, it was brutally efficient. The bombers' forward guns were limited. The firing window was short. One clean pass could cripple an aircraft or shatter a formation. To the men inside the bombers, it felt like staring down a speeding train. Most Allied pilots saw only chaos in this tactic. James Howard saw structure. He studied after-action reports and flight paths, reducing the attack to geometry. Head-on assaults required precision timing, straight-line commitment, and absolute focus. Once a German pilot began the run, options disappeared. There was no room to evade, no time to react. Brake too early and the attack failed. Hold too long and collision was inevitable. Howard identified the flaw. The tactic's power was also its vulnerability. A head-on attack only worked if the sky in front of the bombers was empty, clear, uncontested. If that space became dangerous, if a fighter occupied it aggressively, the entire calculation collapsed. German pilots would be forced to choose between suicide-level risk or aborting the attack altogether. Howard didn't need to destroy the Luftwaffe. He only needed to interrupt their math. And in that realization, the nightmare began to unravel, not with firepower, but with positioning. The target was Oschersleben, deep inside Germany, far beyond the comfort zone of escort fighters. On January 11, 1944, a massive formation of B-17 Flying Fortress pushed toward the aircraft factories below. Their survival depended on timing altitude and escorts that could stay with them all the way in. That morning, James Howard led his P-51 Mustang flight ahead of the bomber stream. Then everything unraveled. Radio calls broke down. Other fighter groups turned back low on fuel. German interceptors swarmed in numbers Howard had never seen before, 30, maybe more. The bomber formation began to lose its protective umbrella, exposed at the exact moment the Luftwaffe preferred to strike. Standard procedure was clear: disengage, preserve aircraft, return with the bombers that could be saved. Howard ignored it. Fuel gauges dipped toward reserve. Ammunition was finite. He was now separated from friendly fighters staring into a sky filled with enemy aircraft. One decision remained: turn away and survive, or stay and fight alone against impossible odds to protect aircraft that could not protect themselves. Doctrine offered no guidance for this moment. There was no checklist for voluntary isolation. Howard chose to stay not out of impulse, but calculation. He understood the geometry unfolding in front of him. He knew where the Luftwaffe had to fly. He knew where the bombers were weakest. This wasn't bravery in the traditional sense. It was a deliberate rejection of the rules made at 25,000 feet with no margin for error. And once that choice was made, there was no turning back. Every escort manual said the same thing: stay outside the bomber box. Fighters were taught to roam wide, intercept threats early, and never get trapped inside the tight geometry of a bomber formation. Flying close was considered passive dangerous even. Limited maneuvering room, friendly fire risk, no escape vector. James Howard did the opposite. Instead of circling at a distance, he drove his P-51 Mustang straight into the heart of the bomber stream, sliding in close to the B-17 Flying Fortress formations. Not above them, not behind them, among them. From the outside, it looked reckless. From the inside, it was calculated. By positioning himself inside the bomber's defensive box, Howard transformed his fighter into a mobile shield. Any Luftwaffe pilot attempting a head-on attack now faced a new problem. The space in front of the bombers was no longer empty. It was occupied by a fast-moving, unpredictable threat. Howard wasn't hunting enemy aircraft. He was blocking access. Every time German fighters lined up their runs, Howard placed his Mustang directly in their path, forcing split-second decisions at closing speeds where hesitation meant death. Attack through him and risk collision. Break off and lose the firing solution. The bombers didn't need him to shoot down the enemy. They needed him to stand in the way. In that moment, the P-51 stopped being a classic interceptor and became something entirely new: a positional weapon, a psychological barrier, a living disruption to Luftwaffe timing and geometry. Howard wasn't fighting the enemy's planes. He was fighting their options. And the sky around the bombers began to change. What James Howard was doing over Germany wasn't instinctive flying. It was geometry under fire. The Luftwaffe's most lethal weapon, the head-on attack, depended on one fragile assumption: a clear, predictable approach path. German pilots needed a straight line, precise timing, and an unobstructed firing lane to punch through a bomber formation in seconds. Howard shattered that assumption. Instead of chasing fighters from behind or diving in pursuit, he placed his P-51 Mustang directly into the attack vector itself. He flew where the Germans had to go, Every time they committed, they found a Mustang accelerating toward them, forcing a brutal choice at closing speeds approaching 600 miles per hour. Hold the line and risk a mid-air collision. Brake early and lose the shot. Howard didn't need kills. He needed hesitation. By occupying the head-on corridor, he collapsed the enemy's timing. Attacks unraveled before they began. Formations scattered. Pilots aborted runs instinctively, not because they were outgunned, but because the geometry no longer worked. Below him, the B-17 Flying Fortress crews felt the difference immediately. The sky ahead, once a funnel of death, became strangely quiet. The Luftwaffe was still there, but their rhythm was gone. This was combat at its most technical. No dramatic dogfights, no spiraling chases, just positioning so precise it denied the enemy the ability to fight effectively at all. Howard had turned airspace into a weapon. He wasn't overpowering the enemy. He was removing their solutions one disrupted attack line at a time. And in that invisible battle of angles and seconds, the bombers kept flying. By now, the numbers were against him. After nearly half an hour in continuous contact, James Howard was running out of everything that mattered. Fuel hovered near reserve. Ammunition counters told an ugly story. 3 of his 4.50 caliber guns had jammed victims of prolonged firing and brutal G-forces. By any conventional measure, the fight was over. Howard stayed. With firepower gone, he shifted tactics. No longer trying to destroy, he focused on deception and pressure. He used repeated high-speed dives, aggressive nose-on passes, and sudden altitude changes maneuvers designed not to kill, but to convince. Each dive forced German pilots to react as if he were fully armed. Each approach threatened collision. Each appearance in their windscreen reset the same lethal calculation: commit and die, or break and survive. Howard became a constant variable, unpredictable, relentless, impossible to ignore. Inside the bomber formation, crews watched in disbelief. The same lone Mustang kept reappearing again and again, as if refusing to leave the sky. The Luftwaffe was still present in force, but their attacks had lost coherence. No clean runs, no synchronized strikes, just fragments. This was no longer about machinery. Howard was flying on mental endurance, exploiting fear timing and human limits. He understood that even elite pilots could only tolerate so many aborted attacks before doubt set in. Momentum was slipping, not because the Germans were beaten, but because they were being denied resolution. For 30 minutes, with a wounded aircraft and almost nothing left to give, Howard held the line. Not with bullets, but with presence. And sometimes, in war, that is enough. Inside the aluminum skins of the B-17 Flying Fortress, the war was usually experienced in fragments. Brief flashes of enemy fighters, sudden impacts shouted warnings over intercoms. But on this mission, something felt different. The attacks kept coming, yet they never quite landed. Gunners watched the sky ahead, expecting the familiar head-on charge, only to see German fighters break away at the last second. Again and again. The reason soon became clear. There was a single P-51 Mustang flying impossibly close, sliding across their forward arcs like a living barricade. It didn't leave. It didn't retreat. It just kept showing up. Crewmen later struggled to describe what they were seeing. One fighter alone weaving in front of an entire bomber wing, forcing enemy aircraft to scatter without firing a shot. To men accustomed to feeling exposed and hunted, It was surreal, almost unreal. Some thought it was a group at first. It had to be. No single pilot could cover that much space, disrupt that many attacks. But the Mustang kept returning from every angle, always where the Germans wanted to be next. Morale inside the bombers shifted. Tension eased, not because the danger was gone, but because someone was actively holding it back. The Luftwaffe was no longer dictating the fight. The bombers weren't reacting anymore. They were moving forward. Later crew reports would call it the most incredible escort we ever saw. Others described it more simply, a miracle in a silver airplane. But what they were witnessing wasn't magic. It was the visible effect of a single mind imposing order on chaos, turning fear geometry and timing into protection. For the men in the B-17S, that lone Mustang wasn't just an escort. It was proof that the sky could be controlled. When the mission reports reached command, they didn't read like combat logs. They read like a contradiction. A single fighter, outnumbered more than 30-1. No confirmed kill count worth mentioning. Yet an entire bomber formation survived a situation that doctrine said it shouldn't. The United States Army Air Forces was forced to confront something uncomfortable. James Howard hadn't won by overwhelming the enemy. He'd won by invalidating their plan. In a war obsessed with statistics, aircraft destroyed, sorties, flown tonnage, dropped. Howard's achievement defied traditional metrics. There was no dramatic tally of victories to point to. What existed instead was absence bombers that didn't fall formations, that didn't break crews, that made it home. That absence mattered. Howard became one of only 2 fighter pilots in the European theater to receive the Medal of Honor. Newspapers struggled to frame the story. Headlines called him a one-man Air Force, a lone warrior who stood between American bombers and annihilation. But Howard himself rejected the myth. He didn't describe courage. He didn't describe heroism. He described problem-solving. He spoke about positioning timing, understanding enemy behavior, and exploiting inevitabilities in human decision-making. His actions weren't emotional. They were methodical, the result of preparation meeting opportunity at exactly the right altitude. The award didn't just recognize bravery, it marked a rare moment when the institution acknowledged something deeper, that the future of air combat wouldn't belong to the loudest or the boldest, but to those who understood systems better than their enemies. James Howard wasn't celebrated for breaking records. He was honored for breaking assumptions. And that made him dangerous in a way the Luftwaffe never saw coming. What happened over Oschersleben didn't stay in the sky. It followed the mission reports back to headquarters and forced the 8th Air Force to confront a hard truth. The old escort doctrine had failed. Fighters roaming at distance could intercept some threats, but they couldn't stop the most dangerous attacks at the moment that mattered most. What Howard demonstrated was radical in its simplicity. Bombers survived not when enemies were chased, but when attack space was denied. Analysts noticed something unsettling. Howard hadn't destroyed the Luftwaffe. He had disrupted their decisions. By placing his fighter inside critical approach corridors, he turned empty air into contested air. German pilots weren't being beaten, they were being blocked. Doctrine began to shift. Escort pilots were trained to think less like hunters and more like guardians of geometry. Presence replaced pursuit. Positioning replaced chasing. Success was no longer measured only in kills, but in bombers that stayed in formation and made it home. The P-51 Mustang became the backbone of this new philosophy, not just because of its range or speed, but because it allowed fighters to stay where they mattered most. What Howard improvised alone became institutional logic. Modern air combat would later formalize this idea under different names, but the principle was set in 1944: control the enemy's options, and you control the fight. The escort mission was no longer about firepower. It was about being impossible to ignore. After the war, James Howard didn't chase legends. He stayed quiet, analytical, eventually retiring as a brigadier general. When asked about Auschwitz, he dismissed the word heroism. What he described instead was problem solving. Howard believed the outcome wasn't about courage alone. It was about understanding systems, machines, people, and the invisible rules that governed decision-making under pressure. He knew the P-51's limits as well as its strengths. He knew the enemy's doctrine, and he knew where those two realities collided. That belief outlived the war. Modern air combat still reflects Howard's lesson: victory doesn't always come from destruction. It comes from control of space, of timing, of the enemy's options. Presence, positioning, cognitive dominance. The language has evolved, but the principle remains unchanged.